Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Well, Theodor Herzl was the visionary of the State of Israel. His dream and his initiative consolidated the process that led to the birth in 1948 of the Jewish state that he foresaw. But between Herzl's development of a concept for a Jewish homeland and the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state, his Zionist vision had a less well-known support system: world's fairs and international expositions. That's why we're so pleased today to have as our guest a man who combines his passions for Zionist and Israeli history and for the compelling visual excitement of world's fairs. David Matlow owns the world's largest private collection of Theodor Herzl memorabilia, and he'll talk to us about Pavilions of Promise, the story of the willing of the State of Israel into existence through national pavilions at world's fairs held long before the country's independence in 1948. David will describe the ways in which partnerships between diaspora Zionists in the host cities and their counterparts living in Israel created pavilions that revealed Zionist achievements on the world stage and the necessity for the Jewish state that Herzl envisioned. He'll also discuss Herzl's inspiration for a Jewish state and how his incredible collection of Herzl items helps to create a better understanding of the modern Zionist movement and the State of Israel. David, thank you for being here. Glad to have you with us to start this new year.
Thank you for inviting me to participate, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Well, as an introduction, give us some background on your interests, your collection, and some of the key discoveries that you've made since you began collecting Theodor Herzl memorabilia.
Well, you'll see behind me various folders and binders. That's part of my collection. I'm here in Toronto, and as you said, I have the world's largest Herzl collection. And I have always been a collector. Since I was a kid, I collected stamps and coins, and living in Toronto, Toronto Maple Leaf memorabilia, hockey cards, things like that. And I also have had a fascination with Herzl, which is a little odd to think of an 8 or 10-year-old boy being fascinated with Herzl. In part, it comes from my family history, generations of Zionists. My grandparents moved from Toronto to Israel in 1954 to fulfill their dream of living in Israel. And my father, who was a student at the University of Toronto, left U of T after third year to fight in the War of Independence as a member of Machal. So I lived a life steeped in the love for the State of Israel, and then my collecting and my Herzl and my Israel passion combined to create this collection. And I have this habit of everything that I do to extreme. So when I start collecting Herzl memorabilia, I wind up with the world's largest collection. Within the collection, I have maybe about 25 items that have actually been signed by Herzl: letters, cards, postcards. One of my favorite items is a postcard with a famous picture of Herzl on the balcony in Basel overlooking the Rhine, which was taken at the Fifth Zionist Congress in 1901, signed by Herzl, which means, like kids do to baseball stars or football stars, took their picture and asked the person to sign it. Someone asked Herzl to sign his own picture. He was a superstar. So that's one of the jewels in my collection.
Well, where do you look for new acquisitions? I'm sure that the internet has probably helped not only yourself, but of course, many collectors. This is a way to kind of sit in your office or in your, wherever it is that you have your computer, and you can hunt for these things. But how do you go through this process? Is it word of mouth? Is there kind of a society of Herzl collectors? How does it work?
There really isn't a society. It's a lonely business being a Herzl collector. There are very few of us. I am pretty out there because I believe that by talking about Herzl, there are important lessons to be learned and inspiration to be taken from what his life's work and his dreams. So I'm pretty well out there talking about my collection, and that has the collateral benefit. It's not the purpose of it, but it has the benefit of people knowing about my interest in collecting. From time to time, I get in the mail a Herzl item. Someone's cleaning up their grandparents' apartment or found something and they want it to go to a good home, so they send it to me. I just turned 61, so I'm not young, but in the world of Herzl collecting, I'm extremely young. And so from time to time, I get inquiries from people who are putting their affairs in order and have this massive collection and want to entrust it or sell it, actually, not give it, to somebody who will care for it and nurture it and benefit from it. And so I bought a number of magnificent collections. So the collection has been built piece by piece, sometimes on eBay, very rarely, because there are many Herzl items on eBay. There are many online auctions, stamp auctions, Judaica auctions, Israeliana auctions. Israeliana is a word. And so from all those things together, piece by piece, and then block by block, the collection has been built.
We're jumping ahead a little bit here because we want to talk about Herzl himself, but he was a tremendously popular figure amongst the Jewish masses. And is that one of the reasons why there was this proliferation of items connected to him?
Herzl was brilliant. In addition to being a lawyer and a playwright and a journalist, he was a polypotentialite. He knew so many things. He knew economics, he knew law, he knew politics. But he also, I believe, was one of the early proponents of branding and marketing. He understood that the idea that he had, the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people, was preposterous. If standing in the shoes of Herzl when he started to think about this in 1895, it was an impossible, ridiculous idea. And so he set about trying to make it happen. And one of the things he needed to do was to imprint in the minds of Jewish people that this was possible. And so marketing and branding, and they didn't use the word at that time, was something that he understood. So that picture I referred to of him on the balcony of the Three Kings Hotel in Basel, it wasn't a time of snapshots or cell phone pictures. That was a staged photograph that he wanted, him looking into the future, overseeing the Rhine River. He sat for busts and portraits because he understood that the Zionist idea needed symbols, and he became that's one of those symbols. The Zionist flag was another such symbol, and when he died tragically at 44 years old in 1904, the Zionist movement, in order to perpetuate the idea and keep it alive, kept that symbol alive of Herzl. And so people would have in their homes a statue, a portrait of Herzl. As we grew up, in every Zionist building, in synagogues, in classrooms, there were portraits of Herzl. And there was jewelry and medals and knickknacks and all kinds of things with Herzl's image, because it was the way for people to show their commitment and their passion for this idea. So it's not a coincidence. In my belief, it is by design.
You've formulated a mission, which you call the Herzl Project. How did you come up with it, and what are your hopes to achieve your objectives?
So the Herzl Project is my one-person initiative to talk about Herzl. This program is one part of that Herzl Project, to talk about Herzl and to inspire people from Herzl's life and his work. As a collector, there's different ways that people collect. There are many collectors who have very precious items and they keep it in a dark room and they only touch it with white gloves and they don't let anyone see it because they're so worried about all security of the collection. I took a different tact, and my tact was I have a national treasure in behind me, and in fact, all over this house. And it doesn't do much good if only I can benefit from it. So I have chosen to use these items as a tool to share Herzl's message. And I believe that when you see something tactile, something physical, not virtual, though people will see it virtually, but it is a real item that means it didn't happen that long ago. There are no artifacts from Moses, but they're artifacts from Herzl, which means he was a real person who didn't live that long ago, who achieved amazing things. And the Herzl Project's purpose is to inspire people to be a little bit like Herzl, to use their skills and talents like Herzl did. As I said, he was a journalist, he was a playwright, he was a lawyer. He threw all those skills at this dream, this idea to benefit the Jewish people. And I'm hopeful that by learning about Herzl, people in their own lives, because we all have different skills, different talents, different passions, we use those skills towards the benefit of society generally, and a slice of that for the benefit of the Jewish people and the security of the state of Israel. That's the Herzl Project.
Actually, I think we have, we're always looking for anniversaries. And I think, if my math is correct, that in 2024, it'll be 120 years. You spoke about Moses. It'll be 120 years since his death. Would that be right? 1904.
That's correct.
Are you, and we just had, I think we had the Zionist Congress anniversary. When these anniversaries occur, are there calls to you? Is there a demand for materials?
So 2022 has two big anniversaries in the life of Herzl. It's the 125th anniversary of the first Zionist Congress, which was in Basel, and was in August 1897. And Herzl wrote two books. The first, the Judenstaat Medinat HaYehudim, which was his idea, his primer, and his second book, Old Neuland, Old New Land, which was a utopian novel translated, by the way, into Hebrew as Tel Aviv. The city of Tel Aviv is named after Herzl's book, Old Neuland, which was published in 1902. So it's the 120th anniversary of that book. So yes, I do get inbound inquiries. Do I have anything from the World Zionist Organization, the American Zionist Movement? Because in my collection, I have invitations, I have all kinds of material from each of the Zionist Congresses. So you might be seeing, if not me, then things from my collection as we lead up to August of 2022.
Well, let's talk about the man himself. Most of our audience are familiar with the name Theodor Herzl, for sure. Not so much perhaps with his life and his accomplishments. Let's talk about it. Where was he born? Where did he spend his early years? How was he affected by his childhood and experiences from his youth? And what is the most important aspect, do you think, and this is perhaps the $64,000 question, the most important aspect of his life in terms of his dream? What was it that propelled him to this vision?
So he was born in 1860 in Budapest, which is in Hungary. As I said, he died in 1904, so he was only 44 years old when he passed. And I mentioned his Zionist work started in 1896 or so. So everything that we talk about in terms of Herzl's work was done in an 8-year period. And that really is amazing to think about in a time, of course, before internet and computers and air travel. He was able to really get his idea around the world so quickly, and we're still talking about him 100 plus years after his passing. He had an older sister who passed away when he was a teenager, and the family was a huge tragedy. So to start a new life, they moved to Vienna. And so as a teenager, he was in Vienna. He went to law school there. He was a member of a law school, of a university fraternity, which he quit because the fraternity turned anti-Semitic. So there is a myth about Herzl that he was not conscious of his Jewish upbringing and of his Jewish life until he covered the Dreyfus trial, which I'll mention in a second, which was in 1894 when he was 33 years old. But that's not true. He experienced anti-Semitism in his earlier life. He then became a lawyer. He wanted to be a judge. His aspiration, professional aspiration in law was to be a judge. And in Austria at the time, Jews could not be judges. Again, he experienced anti-Semitism. So he quit the profession. He became a playwright. And he wrote a number of plays, that some of them are in behind me, that were performed in theaters in Austria. One of them, which was written in 1894, was called The New Ghetto. And this was about Herzl saying that Jews might be emancipated in a sense, are free to freer in European society than they might otherwise than they previously had been, but there is still a glass ceiling and social restrictions from being able to integrate into the wider population. That was the new ghetto. Herzl was struggling with the issue of anti-Semitism and the dignity of himself and the Jewish people for his whole life. And that new ghetto was written before the Dreyfus trial. Herzl then got a plum position as the foreign correspondent for a prominent Viennese newspaper called the Neue Freie Presse. So to me, it's like the New York Times or the Washington Post, a prominent, serious newspaper. And at the time, Vienna was a center of European culture and politics, something that we don't necessarily appreciate today. He wrote kind of fluff pieces, editorials, travel pieces, personal anecdote kind of stories, like a modern love, but not that you'd see in the New York Times, not about love, but about life. But he then also had a serious side to his profession, where he covered the Dreyfus trial, which was a trial of a Jewish officer in the French army that was wrongfully charged with spying on behalf of the Germans. It was a show trial in Paris, which bubbled up to the top, the anti-Semitism that lay below the surface, which traumatized Herzl greatly, because here he was in France, the home of liberty, equality, fraternity. I won't try and say it in French, even though I'm Canadian, but that even in France, of all places, Jews were not safe, really shocked Herzl to his core. So then he sequestered himself in a hotel. It's called the Hotel Castile in Paris. There's in fact a plaque in front of the hotel on the street in Hebrew that says this is where Herzl wrote The Jewish State, and he wrote this book, which was it was called The Jewish State, A Modern Solution to the Jewish Question. The Jewish question is anti-Semitism. And I know that B'nai B'rith is still fighting on behalf of Jewish people against anti-Semitism. Herzl thought that he had the solution to anti-Semitism, which was a Jewish homeland. And to me, the most remarkable thing about Herzl is that he saw an issue, and he, instead of lamenting about it and fetching about it and whining about it, and wouldn't it be great if somebody did something about it, this man did something about it. He wrote this book. He tried to envision a solution to the Jewish people. He not only tried, he envisioned a solution. And then he went out to speak about it, to sell his plan, to meet with people, crisscrossing by train and then by boat to Israel and in Palestine in 1898, to advance his cause. He literally worked himself to death trying to advance this cause. But that is the amazing feature about Herzl. Ideas are a dime a dozen, but it's a person who goes about trying to make it happen, which changes the world. And Herzl, of course, changed the world for the Jewish people. Unfortunately, too late. Herzl had a sense of the danger that the Jews were living in. He knew that the Jews were living on borrowed time. I mentioned the book Alt Neuland. In Alt Neuland, he has two Jewish characters in Europe talking to each other, and one says to the other when discussing anti-Semitism, written in 1902, pretty soon they'll make us wear the yellow stars again. He didn't know the yellow star is a medieval sign of Jews, and it was a focus for anti-Semitism. Of course, he couldn't have envisioned Nazism and the Holocaust, but he knew that the Jews were in danger, and he worked passionately to find a solution. And that's the most remarkable thing about
Well, that really was the touchstone in terms of the hope that he gave birth to, if you will, for the masses. Because I mentioned in the introduction, he consolidated. There were ideas, but he consolidated it, and I'm sure that really touched, for those who knew about him, heard about him, and in those days, even without the internet, word traveled fast. His popularity grew. I just would say one other thing, about Der Judenstaat and Alt Neuland, is that it wasn't. What he was writing was not only about a dream and a vision. There were practical suggestions as to how this state would operate in terms of its economy and its politics. So he really drilled deeply down into what this meant. It wasn't just only, I think we ought to have a place for ourselves, and it ought to be in our ancient homeland. So I think this was really part of his gene. Did Herzl bring his message to other countries? He did travel. To as you said, to sell this idea to Kaiser and travel to other places. At what stage, as we've talked about attracting followers, at what stage did this really kind of become a movement? Was it just 1897, or was it in that brief period, those 7 years after, that this really started to get going?
Herzl understood that this idea is bigger than one person and that people are mortal. And so he built the infrastructure of a state in creation. And that's the marvelous thing. It took an idea and gave it tangible attributes. So the Zionist Congress in 1897, which was a mere 16 months after he published Alt Neuland, which was early in 1896, was about more than 200 delegates from across Europe and a number from the United States as well, came to Basel. So you had to book a hall, tell people to come, have the hotel accommodations, food. It was in Basel in part because there was kosher food available there. And the Congress became the parliament of the Jewish people. It was a democratically elected organization, constituent body, starting in the Second Zionist Congress in 1898. Depending on how many Zionists there were in your jurisdiction, you got proportional representation. Women had equal voting rights starting in the Second Zionist Congress. That's 1898, 22 years before the United States or Canada had voting rights. It was a very progressive organization. There were 6 Zionist Congresses during Herzl's lifetime. People know about the first Zionist Congress, but don't necessarily know that there were more. There were 22 Zionist Congresses before Israel's independence. It survived his death, and other than interruption during the 2 world wars, continued every 2 years, every 4 years, whatever, through to 1946 was the last one. He also created the World Zionist Organization, which had various constituent organizations, Hadassah in the United States and in Canada, and other. It became an organization, the Jewish National Fund, which was inspired and approved at the 5th Zionist Congress in 1901. The Jewish Colonial Trust, which was approved at the 3rd Zionist Congress in 1899, which became a bank chartered under the laws of England to invest in development and infrastructure. It was about a state in creation. And all of those entities still exist. So he was quickly able to communicate this message because this was a message that people needed. I picture Anatevka and places like that in Eastern Europe, desperate for life where you wouldn't be subject to pogroms. Now, of course, I paint a rosy picture of Herzl's acceptance. There were those who were against Herzl's idea. Religious thought this was heresy. Only the Mashiach can take us to Eretz Israel. There were other people who said, especially in Western Europe, those who had made it, who had integrated or assimilated, said, this is a terrible idea. It's going to make life very dangerous for us because we've worked so hard saying we're just like everyone else, and you're saying we can't ever survive among everyone else. So and even within the Zionist movement, religious Zionism, labor Zionism, communist Zionism, revisionist Zionism, dash Zionism, all kinds of different kinds. But at least within the Zionist movement, it was the same goal, just different ways to get there. So he was able, through his writing, through his personality, through all the knickknacks and things, to be able to be an inspiring figure who was essentially known around the Jewish world and the non-Jewish world.
But just to show you how far this message went, I'll give just my personal story here. So my father, on the eve of, they left Russia with the family. He was 13 years old, 1913, and he told me they had a picture of Herzl in the house. This is a small shtetl, and he and his best friend. He told me that he and his best friend promised. It was on the eve of their leaving for America that they would one day meet in Palestine. So the infusion of this idea, and this is 1913, so already Herzl had passed, but the word was out and the idea was out. And that's how far it really spread. Just one more thing on Herzl's travel. So he met with the German Kaiser, he met with the Rothschilds, he met with various important personages. What was his basic argument? What was his argument to the Kaiser? What was his argument to the Rothschilds? So you met with a powerful international figure, and then, or certainly a leading European figure, and he met with perhaps the most powerful Jewish family at that time.
So to the Rothschilds, and his argument didn't succeed, the Rothschilds were obviously extremely generous and were supporting many settlements, and many of them named after the Rothschilds, and had people, emissaries there that were helping to organize things. And Herzl's argument was, sending in people dribs and drabs, a village here, a village there, not going to get us anywhere, because one day the ruler is going to wake up and say, okay, enough of you people. It's happened throughout the history of Jews in every country we lived in up to the last 100 years or so. And so that's not the way to secure a future for the Jewish people. Let's create as a lawyer, he said he wanted a territory that was secured by international law. So not something that we kind of crept in and bit by bit buying land, but something that was accepted among the nations of the world. To the German Kaiser and the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, since the 1400s or so. The Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe, was starting to weaken and disband, and there was a kinship with the German Kaiser, that's how he gets into the story. But the argument to them was, firstly, anti-Semitism, at least in Austria and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is a problem. And so we can solve your problem by creating a Jewish homeland. So no Jews where you are, and because they'll all be in this Jewish homeland. To the Sultan, he said, you are in financial distress. Your empire is failing. We give you a huge sum of money that will enable the Ottoman Empire to pay off its massive loans, and in return, you give us a charter for the homeland. As an aside, Herzl didn't have that money that he promised to the Sultan, but I guess he figured if the Sultan said yes, the money, if you build the country, the money will come. And so those were the basic arguments. The Sultan said, I cannot permit a Jewish homeland within this Muslim-related territory, or Muslim territory, which is obviously an issue that's still being a friction point to today. And the Kaiser essentially said, well, if the Sultan's not going to do it, then nothing I can do about it. So he then understood the weakening of the Ottoman Empire. He cultivated the British and America. To the British, he cultivated relationships with senior government officials. The Fourth Zionist Congress was in London. That was the only one in his lifetime that wasn't in Basel, in order to bring this issue before the British, who were the world empire at the time. And that work actually bear fruit 13 years after his passing, because it's the antecedent to the Balfour Declaration. And he sent his emissary, one of his emissaries, Jacob de Haas, to America to help organize Zionist life in America. And it was de Haas that got to Louis Brandeis, who became a prominent Zionist, who was able to help the passage of the Balfour Declaration because of his relationship with Woodrow Wilson, and otherwise organizing Zionist activity. So Herzl cultivated the British, but understood that America is or will be an important power and authority and supporter for his dream. So he was active in every which way to get it moving.
So as you've said, Herzl died young. He was 44 years old. What actually happened to him that he did die so young? And do you have information about the Carnegie Hall Memorial, whose notice is now being shown? We're going to show this. Who organized it? How many people attended? And what ultimately happened to the family during the 20th century, the Herzl family?
Right. So obviously very tragic that he died at 44 years old. He was a sickly person. And so he died of heart failure, essentially. He was told by his doctor to slow down, and Herzl said, I have too much to do, so he didn't slow down. He sped up, and was in the summer of 1904. He was told to have bed rest, so he went to the town of Edlach, which I take to be some kind of a resort community in the mountains, and that's where he passed in July the 3rd of 1904. And this was at a time now when someone is ill, and here in Canada, Prince Philip was ill and then passed, and then whenever the Queen is sick, we know exactly what's happening. At that time, you didn't have CNN or day-to-day reports on someone's health, so out of the blue, an announcement was made that Herzl had died, which was a terrible, terrible tragedy for the Jewish people, a national tragedy for the Jewish people. His funeral was in Vienna, and trainloads of people from across Europe came, hundreds and thousands, and from the reporting of the funeral, that's when people in Vienna understood how important this person was, Herzl. It was a tragedy, and so much so that news of his death quickly went across the Atlantic. There were telegraphs at the time, and 2 weeks after his death, I think it was on the 17th of July, there was a memorial held for him in Carnegie Hall. And the New York Times reporting of that memorial says that the Carnegie Hall was full, and thousands of people poured out into the streets around Carnegie Hall who could not get in. It was organized by the Zionist organizations at that time, but to book Carnegie Hall and to have that take place within 2 weeks was incredible. And obviously there were memorials held for Herzl around the world. This was a huge tragedy. And on the theme of tragedy, the family life of Herzl is is a tragedy. This is a father of a nation, the father of a country that has no living descendants. He was married to Julie, had 3 children. So when Herzl died, the children, girl, boy, girl, were something like 17, 15, 13, something like that. And under Herzl's will, he had a different guardian assigned to each of the 3 children. In Austria, the mother had no rights to the children, believe it or not. Julie died in 1909. The kids were orphans. They had separate guardians. They were separated. And to make a long, sad story short, the oldest daughter, Paulina, died in the 30s by a drug overdose in Bordeaux, France. Her brother, Herzl's son Hans, who lived in England most of the time, went to attend her funeral and killed himself to be buried beside her. There was a daughter, Trude. She was married. Trude died in Theresienstadt. Had a son who was sent out on the Kindertransport to England and was in the British Army, was assigned in the Far East and actually stopped by in Palestine for a few days on his way home. But they didn't say he had to be quiet, that he was Herzl's grandson. Ultimately worked for the British Embassy in Washington. And once he learned after the war that his family had perished, he committed suicide himself. Very, very tragic.
Tragic. Well, in the sequence of images that we're viewing now, you've included a 1939 World's Fair photo from Our magazine. It's a picture of the B'nai B'rith ceremony at the Herzl portrait bust located in the Palestine Pavilion at the World's Fair. Tell us a little about the pavilion's planning and what it meant to convey to the fair's visitors. This was 1939, on the eve of World War II, on the eve of the Holocaust. And how did this bust by Boris Schatz, the founder of Israel's Bezalel School, contribute to its message?
Well, the whole presence of Eretz Israel or Palestine at World's Fairs prior to Israel's independence in 1948 is fascinating. And there is it dates back to the late 1800s, and in 1903, there was a World's Fair in St. Louis where a local Zionist, Martin Stiffelman, prevailed upon the organizers to fly the Zionist flag among the nations of the world. So that then became the flag of the State of Israel. People were always looking for an opportunity to advance the cause of Zionism, to give it respectability, to give it prominence, and World's Fairs were an obvious place to do that. And so skipping ahead to the 1930s, there were a number of World's Fairs in the 1930s, in Paris in 1931, in Chicago in 1933, in Brussels in 1935, back to Paris in 1937, and then in New York, in Flushing and Queens in 1939. And all of those, with the exception of 1933, didn't have a pavilion, but had a very huge pageant at Soldier Field before 125,000 people, advancing the cause of Zionism. All the other ones had a pavilion. And the pavilions were essentially joint ventures, joint initiatives between the Shuv, the Jewish residents of Eretz Israel of Palestine, through a company called Mischar V'Te'asiyah, who put on the Levant Fair in Tel Aviv and were experts in putting on exhibitions, and local Zionists. So in the case of New York in 1939, local New York Zionists thought that it would be important to bring the story of Palestine and the achievements of the Jewish people in Palestine, Eretz Israel, in front of the world who would be coming to the World's Fair. Work on this started in 1936. That's when the idea of the World's Fair started. And so a group got together and they hired a gentleman named Meyer Weiskal, who was a Zionist organizer, to conceive and then implement the pavilion. And his idea was that everything in this pavilion should come from Palestine to show the world what we are doing and what we can do. And in part to show that Palestine was a home, a willing and welcoming home for the imperial Jews of Europe, because everybody knew what was happening to the Jews of Europe with the rise of Nazism and the Nuremberg laws and everything that was happening. That when there was the laying of the cornerstone of this pavilion in 1938, the program talks about this being a beacon of hope for the imperial Jews of Europe. And then in 1939, when the World's Fair opened in the spring, it was just I think it was 10 days after the British passed the White Paper, which restricted immigration to Palestine at the time when the right to immigrate to Palestine was most needed. And so this pavilion became a rallying point for protesting against the British and for the need for a Jewish homeland. The opening of the pavilion had over 100,000 people in the courtyard in front of the pavilion. And Albert Einstein spoke, and he said that to paraphrase, that the World's Fairs generally show what's good, what's progress, what's the advancements of technology and culture and society, but at this given time, the clouds of horror and despair are falling on the world. Everybody knew what was happening, and going to that pavilion, which was the second most popular pavilion for a country that didn't yet exist, to be able to see what was happening in Palestine. And within that pavilion, it was showing the work of in industry and in advances in healthcare and technology and culture, the Hebrew newspapers and plays. It was real, like all World's Fair pavilions, showing off what's going on. But this had a deeper meaning because it was both showing off the progress and also saying, let us be the home for the people who need us. And so that these pavilions were a tool that people used to advance the cause of Zionism. And there are those who say that the pavilion in New York in 1939 essentially performed or willed the state of Israel into existence. The Zionist flag flew among the nations of the world. In the World's Fair, there was a pavilion from the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Jewish Palestine. It was showing the world as if this country actually existed. The General Motors had a pavilion there. It was called Futurama, where you could see what life would be like way, way out in the future, like in 1960. And when you went to that pavilion, you got a button like this, which says, "I have seen the future." And in fact, on the World's Fair grounds, the future for the Jewish people was in fact envisioned, because on the World's Fair grounds, what's now the Queen's Museum, was the New York City Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair. And between 1945 and 1950, that was the temporary home of the United Nations. And the UN Partition Resolution of November 29, 1947, which called for the creation of the Jewish state, was passed in that building, not 200 yards, I was going to say meters from Canada, not 200 yards from the Jewish Palestine Pavilion. That pavilion envisioned the state of Israel. And yes, there was a Herzl sculpture that you described. And there was also, as you walked into the pavilion, there was Herzl's motto, "If you will it, it is no dream. Ein tirtzu, ein so agada." And of course, his dream was fulfilled on that very same fairgrounds.
Well, we've been talking about the presence of Eretz Israel at World's Fairs before 1948. But there is a World's Fair called an Expo happening right now that really has kind of brought all of this full circle. So tell us about that.
So I call these pavilions of Palestine before Israel's independence, pavilions of promise. What was the promise? The promise, of course, was the promised land, but was also the promise of a Jewish homeland for the Jewish people. That was the promise that was intended to be communicated at those pavilions. Fast forward to 2022, we have now a World's Fair in Dubai. And in that World's Fair, there are 192 nations there. One of those nations is the State of Israel. Interestingly, the State of Israel was invited by Dubai before the Abraham Accords of a year ago and had accepted the invitation even before there was peace. But the World's Fair was delayed from last year to this year, and there is this State of Israel pavilion. And I just spoke to someone yesterday who was in Dubai and attended the pavilion, and he says at night they're outside in the courtyard of the pavilion, they're playing Israeli music, and you have people of all nations, Israelis, Arabs with mid-Arab gowns, dancing, singing, being together. So this is the pavilion of a different kind of promise, which is the promise of peace. That, getting back to Herzl, the idea in 1896 that there would be a Jewish state was preposterous and unlikely, and it happened. And that is even more of a preposterous idea than the possibility today of the State of Israel living in peace with all its neighbors. If the State of Israel could happen, then that same state living in peace with its neighbors is possible. And we have a vision of that at the pavilion in Dubai today as we speak. And so the idea of the Herzl Project, one of them is to inspire people to not get frustrated, not get distracted, to realize the jewel, the miracle of the State of Israel that exists today, and to use our skills and talents like Herzl did to make that state better, more secure, and ultimately living in peace among all the nations of the world, which was exactly what Herzl envisioned 125 years ago.
Well, David, that's a great way to close. You know, when I visit the Knesset, and I'm in the hall, in the chamber, that visage of Herzl, who looks down on the Knesset, it also is it's a very inspiring scene when you see that. And all of this, it's interesting that all of this, as you said, for Herzl, it was all accomplished in 8 years. But this was really 50 years until the creation of the State of Israel. Now another 50 years, more or less, or a little bit less. It's only a 100-year project, and yet so much that he started has produced really so much. I would just ask one final question. How do you think Israelis and others remember Herzl today? A lot of important historical figures fade from memory, not for historians, not for others, not for people like ourselves who are working in this area in one way or another every day, but people fade as years go on. Herzl is still there, front and center. So how do you think he's remembered?
Well, there's different ways that he's remembered. He keeps being repurposed and reimagined. So here's one. This is the Herzl as a hipster. And one would say, well, that might be insulting, but it's not. It means that he still has relevance. He's still being talked about. He's still being thought about. Herzl's idea of the Jewish state, he was quoted as saying, in his view, the purpose of Zionism is not simply to have a plot of land for our weary people, to build a model society on that land. So the aspiration to do that the need to do that continues and will always continue. So yes, people know Herzl, the man on the balcony, the man with the beard. There's Herzl beer. There's Herzl wine. I have it all. There's Herzl on a SodaStream bottle. There's all kinds of new Herzl knickknacks, but he's being remembered. And when he's remembered, people might ask, what did he try and do? What did he do? And how we can complete his dream. His dream was fulfilled with the creation of the State of Israel, but it has not been completed. And so Herzl continues to be on new art, new items, new images, advertisements for all kinds of weird things. Like sometimes we're in Toronto and we see ads from Buffalo TV channels with Abraham Lincoln selling cars, I guess around President's Day or whatever. He's remembered, sometimes jokingly, often lovingly, because the work needs to continue. And if I may, I do want to commend B'nai B'rith, who is an international in the organization that you run in your important work that's advancing constantly the cause of Israel, the support for the Jewish homeland, and fighting the fight against anti-Semitism, which was what motivated Herzl in the first place. So please, Yasher Koach, and keep up the important work that you are all doing.
Well, thank you, and we're very proud of the work that we do. Well, check out David Matlow's impressive collection of Theodor Herzl memorabilia and more at herzlcollection.com. David, thank you for joining me in helping to create a better understanding of Theodor Herzl, the Zionist movement, the State of Israel, for the betterment of the Jewish people. It's been a real pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks again to David Matlow for being with us and discussing Theodor Herzl, Zionism, and how national pavilions at World's Fairs help the State of Israel come to be. And of course, to all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, David Matlow, and for B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.